This one time, past, present, and future walk into a bar. It was tense. Not funny? Anyway, I started this introduction with a joke because the genre we're going to talk about in this lesson is comedy. The third lesson in the course Literary Genres is about comedy. It is being explained by Prakhar Patidar. I am a student of English literature, and like every lesson, in this lesson we'll first talk about the definition. What do we really mean by comedy? It is defined to be a fictional work in which the materials are selected and managed primarily in order to create humor and amusement. It's a piece of literature, it's a work of literature that aims to make the reader laugh, and for this it employs certain techniques which result in a comical effect. Origins of the term comedy are found in ancient Greece. What happened in Athenian democracy, the public opinion of voters was influenced by the political satire performed by the comic poets at the theatres. So this is sort of the origin of the genre comedy. The theatrical genre of Greek comedy can be described as a dramatic performance which pits two groups or societies against each other in an amusing conflict. How Aristotle has defined comedy, he has said that it is an imitation of men worse than average. Now, this does not mean that the characters that are in a comedy are usually worse in every sense. They're not worse in every sense, they just have certain antiques or they just have certain peculiarities about them which are portrayed that way in order to generate humor. Let us talk about the characteristics of a comical work. The first characteristic is that the main aim of a comedy is to generate humor and laughter. Second is that it employs several techniques like wit, jokes, gags, and slapstick comedy, and physical bustle and horseplay, and several other techniques so that the reader is amused. Third is characters with absurd antiques and comical appearances or comical personalities are there. And fourth characteristic of a comical work is that it usually ends in happy ending. So comedy is for light-hearted entertainment. It does not want the reader or the observer to give the reader or observer a very heavy dose of emotions. It is just to make them laugh and amuse them. Depending on the intellectual appeal of a comical work, it can be divided into two types. First is high comedy and the second is low comedy. So high comedy usually appeals to the intellect and it produces thoughtful humor. A great example of this is Much Ado About Nothing, in which Shakespeare has given a great example of his wit. And low comedy is has little or no intellectual appeal. It aims to produce laughter using jokes and gags and slapstick humor, but it does not rely much on the wordplay or thoughtful form of comedy. There are certain subgenres of comedy which can be categorized into these two types. These subgenres are romantic comedy, satiric comedy, comedy of manners, farce, and comedy of humors. Let us talk about these subgenres in detail, starting with romantic comedy. Romantic comedies usually depict love stories which are intertwined with light-hearted humor, and this subgenre of comedy was developed by Elizabethan dramatists, and it is based on the model of contemporary prose romances. So these Elizabethan dramatists took inspiration from contemporary prose romances, from the works of contemporary prose writers, and then molded it into romantic dramas, romantic comical dramas. Salient features of a romantic comical work is that it typically has a good looking heroine and a charming hero, and their love story faces a lot of problems, but in the end all is well. In the end love conquers all, and the plot is usually that of a boy meets girl plot, and this is the plot which is adopted in many of the romantic comedies these days, if you see in movies or if you see in novels. And then for the comical effect, there are comical side characters with several antiques, side characters with comical appearances. Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare are great examples of romantic comedies. Second is satiric comedy. Main aim of satiric comedy is to ridicule the political policies, philosophical doctrines, and the society in general. So, what a satirical comedy does is that it holds up a mirror to show the shortcomings and the flaws of a society in a comical way. Who was the early master of satiric comedy? It was a Greek writer, Aristophanes, and this form of comedy uses wit and irony to bring out a comical effect, and it ridicules the illogical conventions and norms that are followed by people. Here are a few examples of satiric comedy. It's Walpole and Alchemist by Ben Jonson. And then if we move a bit away from examples of drama, then there is the mock epic by Alexander Pope, which comes under the category of burlesque, and burlesque is a form of comedy. It's a form of satire. The third subgenre is comedy of manners. Comedy of manner originated under new style of comedy which was created by the Greek writer Menander, and after it had been originated this way, it developed by Roman dramatist Plautus and Terence in the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BC. The works of Plautus and Terence had certain stereotypical characters which have now become the stock characters. These characters were like impulsive lovers, the clever servant, old and stodgy parents, and the wealthy rival. All of these formed the main characters of the works of Plautus and Terence, and later on they became the stock characters. By stock characters, we mean stereotypical characters. These kind of characters are found in the later comedy of manners, which were written by later writers like William Wycherley and Oliver Goldsmith. English comedy of manners followed a certain pattern. Firstly, it was exemplified and it was taken to heights by Shakespeare, who was inspired by original comedy of manners, that was the Greek and the Roman comedy of manners, and then it developed into Restoration comedy. Restoration comedy deals with the relations of men and women living in a sophisticated upper class society and relies for comic effect in a large part on the wit and the sparkle of the dialogue, often in the form of a witty conversational give and take. Some people thought this kind of comedy, this kind of writing to be a bit indecent, and a reaction to this was sentimental comedy, which was a middle class reaction to the indecency of the kind of dialogues the Restoration comedy had. Here are the examples of the 3 kinds of comedies I've just discussed. Love's Labour Lost by Shakespeare is an example of comedy of manners. The Country Wife is a Restoration comedy, and She Stoops to Conquer is again an example of Restoration comedy. Fourth subgenre is farce. Farce is something that is designed to provoke the audience into simple, hearty laughter. So it does not care much about the style or the language or the plot. It just focuses on one thing, and that is to produce laughter. It was a component of medieval miracle plays, but then later on it developed into a subgenre in itself. How does a farce create the kind of situations that would bring out the kind of laughter a farce is aiming at? First thing that forms the important characteristic of a farce is that it has highly exaggerated and caricatured characters. For example, if a character has a big nose, then it would be said about the character that there's a face on that nose instead of saying ki there's a nose on that face. Now, these characters with exaggerated personalities are often put in improbable and ludicrous situations, and another trick that is used to produce laughter is use of sexual mix-ups or broad verbal humor or slapstick comedy. It's like physical comedy. And the 5th subgenre is the comedy of humors. Comedy of humors was developed by Ben Jonson, and it was based on the ancient psychological theory of 4 humors. The theory of 4 humors states that the humors were held to be the 4 primary fluids: blood, phlegm, chlor, and melancholy, and whose temperament, that is mixture, was held to determine a person's both physical condition and the type of character. Usually in his plays, each major character had a preponderant humor, that is, one of the four stated humor influenced his or her character more. An example of this is Every Man Out of His Humor by Ben Jonson. And with that, we are done with discussing comedy. What are we going to do next? We're going to discuss satire, which is in close relation to comedy. And that's it. I hope this helped. Thank you for taking this lesson. Please continue on with the course because we're still left with a handful number of lessons. And I hope this helped you understand comedy better. If you have any suggestions or doubt, you can always put them in the comment and I'll try my best to clarify it. Thank you.